Good evening, everybody. Good evening, University Rosedale residents. Bonsoir à tous. It is a real pleasure to have you all join us tonight. I see the numbers trickling in. This is really exciting. Welcome to one of the many GreenPAC debates happening across this entire country this week. As you know, the GreenPAC 100 initiative really aims to provide nonpartisan debates for Canadians so that they can hear about the environmental issues that matter to them. So in University Rosedale, we're really lucky to have this event put together by some wonderful community members and organizations. The organizers of tonight's debate are Climate Fast, Green 11, and Trinity St. Paul's United Church, in partnership with the University of Toronto Student Union, or UTSU. Before we start, I'll just tell you quickly a little bit about myself. My name is Aliénor, or Ali Rougeau. I go by she, her pronouns, and I live in the riding. I've been an environmental and human rights activist for a long time. I also recently graduated from the University of Toronto studying economics and public policy, and I now work at Environmental Defense working on climate and energy issues. I'd also like to introduce you to my co-host for tonight, Catherine. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. And I'll give a short introduction of who I am just as we jump into our debate tonight. I am here tonight as the Vice President Public and University Affairs at the University of Toronto Students Union, or the UTSU. We are a nonpartisan organization that represents over 38,000 students at the University of Toronto. And in my role, I advocate at the federal, provincial, and municipal level for issues concerning our young people today.
So great to have you, great to have the union support this debate, and really glad that you're doing this work for the students as well. Now let's talk about the candidates that you'll be hearing from tonight. We have Tim Grant here, that's with the Green Party. We have Chrystia Freeland with the Liberal Party, whom you might also know as your current Member of Parliament and as the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and Nicole Robichaud with the New Democratic Party. So glad that all of you could join us. Thank you very much. I'll also say that the candidate for the Conservative Party was invited to this debate, Stephen Taylor, but we were unable to get a confirmation of this participation, and so we had to proceed without him. So as you get settled in, I'd like to share a little bit more about my personal relationship to the land that I'm calling you from. I'm hosting this debate as a settler on Indigenous territory, and University Rosedale, where I assume many of you are, is located in Tkaronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And the city that we now call Toronto is still home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. The area that I'm calling from specifically is covered by Treaty 13. And today we're speaking about environmental and climate-related issues. And it's important to remember and to really know that Indigenous people have been stewards of these lands for millennia. And Indigenous knowledge will be an essential part of addressing this crisis that we're facing. I'll also flag that many Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of dealing with the effects of environmental degradation. Finally, I'd like to send, and I know that I'm joined with the partners that hosted this event, I'd like to send thoughts of support and solidarity with the many Indigenous nations that have been dealing with the heartbreaking and horrible discoveries of the unmarked grave sites at former residential schools. We hope that the truth is going to continue being uncovered, and we want to make sure that us as allies commit to learning more about Canada's colonial history, and we really want to be accomplices in the reconciliation that still needs to happen. I really encourage you to look more into the history, into the lands that you're on, into Treaty 13, as you reside on these lands and as you continue to enjoy being here. Now, I think you've heard enough from me, and it's time to hear from those who hope to represent us in Parliament. I'm going to invite each candidate in 2 minutes or less to introduce themselves, tell us a bit of who they are, why they are the right candidate for University Rosedale, and why they want to represent us. And if that's okay, Chrystia, I'll start with you.
Of course it is. So merci beaucoup, Eleanor, pour l'introduction. And let me start like you by acknowledging that we're here on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. C'est un très grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici parmi vous ce soir et je suis vraiment heureuse de pouvoir discuter d'un enjeu aussi important que le climat. Let me also say a really warm virtual hello to my fellow candidates. Hello, Tim. Hello, Nicole. I have tremendous respect for both of them and for the work that both of them do on the environment for social justice in Canada and the world. Let me say a little bit about who I am. My name is Chrystia Freeland. I live in the riding. I am a really proud mother of 3 amazing, wonderful children. I have had the real privilege since 2013 of representing this community in Parliament. And before that, for many years, I was a journalist, mostly an international journalist. I'm really glad that we have a chance tonight to talk about climate. This is really the existential challenge of our times. It is a huge challenge. The green transition is also a big opportunity for Canada if we get it right. And I am proud to talk about our government's record and our government's plans. We have a plan which is ambitious, achievable, and fully costed. And I'm going to conclude by quoting Andrew Weaver. He's a climate scientist and former leader of the BC Greens. This is what he said about our plan. This is a plan that reflects the urgency and scale of the crisis. I'm extremely impressed at how ambitious the Liberal Party of Canada's plan is, and I'm confident that this is the right plan for Canada. So am I, and I hope that's what you will all decide too. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrystia. Nicole?
Thank you, Ali. Hi, everyone. I guess I'm the new kid on the block here. So I'm going to spend a bit of time introducing myself, talking about my experiences. My pronouns are she and they. And I also want to reiterate both with what Chrystia said and also what Ali said earlier. We can't talk about climate without talking about Indigenous rights. They go hand in hand. And the new Democratic Plan commits to making reconciliation a central part of our plan. I, like Chrystia, also have a background in journalism. I worked at the CBC for a couple of years. And over the past decade, I've been engaged in humanitarian work. So responding to natural disasters, conflicts, and epidemics like cholera and Ebola. And through doing that work, I kept seeing the same people impacted over and over, those who are already vulnerable and living in precarious conditions to begin with. And I started to feel that humanitarian work, although it's important, of course, you're responding to a need, what it doesn't do is address the root causes of why certain people are disproportionately impacted, which we're seeing here as well under COVID, and the climate crisis. So that's actually what's pushed me into wanting to go into politics, is to tackle those issues, but at the systemic root cause level. So I'm really happy to be here with you tonight because this is an issue that I feel very passionate about. And I also wanted to mention as well that in the New Democrats plan, you will see in the 15-page document, everything that we talk about in there, you will see climate interwoven throughout that plan because we know how important it is to address this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. And Tim?
Thanks, and first of all, a shout out to all the people who organized this debate, Ali, and the tech people in the background. I know how much work is involved. To Chrystia, thank you for your very hard work as our MP for the last 2 years. You've been certainly very busy. And Nicole, when I read your bio, which you referred to moments ago about your humanitarian work in Africa and Haiti, I realized the NDP had a first-class candidate in this riding, and so kudos to you. Look, I don't probably need as much introduction as others because I have been around a while. I've been heavily involved in local community activities for decades, 2 decades anyways, and I'm currently chairing the Net Zero Carbon Committee of the Harvard Village Residents Association. That's an extremely ambitious project working with 26 communities across the city. But the reason I'm back as a candidate, there's a number of reasons. Let me highlight two quick ones. One is that, we published in the run-up to the last election, Mission Impossible, a 20-point plan to demonstrate how Canada could meet the Paris climate targets. And we'd hope that that would stimulate a national conversation that would take us beyond whether we should or shouldn't have a carbon tax. That didn't happen. Another frustration was that CBC actually hired Navius Research to compare the climate platforms of the four parties, but they didn't release the report. And sadly, what it demonstrated, and that was unfortunate for us because they estimated that we were the only party that could meet the Paris climate targets, or in fact, we exceeded them according to their research, of getting us down to 530 megatons by 2030. And the NDP were the next best, but at 610, I think, the Liberals and then the Conservatives at 670. All three parties missed the mark by a considerable measure. And I mention that not to denigrate, but simply to say that in spite of lofty provinces, unfortunately, both parties are back with a similar set of plans that I fear will not get us where we need to go. Anyways, I look forward to all the questions on these and other topics in the next 90 minutes.
Merci beaucoup à tous les trois. Thank you to the three of you. I appreciate the fact that you are so courteous and greeting each other. I think it's very lovely to see that during a campaign, and I hope that we can all continue to do that. Thank you all. And I really appreciate the powerful words and the diverse backgrounds that all brought you to the environmental issues, and I'm sure it resonates with many of the residents. Now, we're all gathered here because numerous international agencies have been raising the alarm, whether it's the International Energy Agency or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have all been making it clear we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to do so very rapidly if we want even a chance at reaching something below 1.5 degrees, above which we will face catastrophic climate breakdown. So we know that the action we need to take is pressing, and that means that the next federal government will have a huge role. This is why today we really hope to hear about which actions you, as a elected member of parliament, will take to resolve these challenges. And so I hope we can really take the next hour and a half to get a sense of what you hope to do and how you hope to lead us through the crisis and into a livable future. And I'll ask that as you answer, you respect the time that we're allocating, that you talk about your proposals as much as possible, and that you try to limit too much answering or referring to past actions or inactions, but really to think about how we're going to move forward and how we can trust that you're going to lead us through the crisis. All right, so we have a lot to cover, and I like to start with some short yes or no questions to kind of get a good overview of where you're at and how you want to address these big challenges. We know, and we're still dealing with the pandemic, but this pandemic has brought to light the links between the climate crisis, the human impact on the environment, and the link that all of these have to health. Actually, a lot of scientists and medical professionals are warning us about how human health is going to be affected by climate breakdown. So I'm going to ask 4 successive questions about the measures that, as an elected official, you would take to address these interlinked crises. For each question, please give me a yes or no answer, and then you have a maximum of 30 seconds to expand if you need. Okay, so let's give this a try. The first question I want to ask you is, given the acceleration of climate breakdown, the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions this decade, and Canada's historic emissions, will you advocate requiring all sectors to reduce carbon emissions so that Canada can achieve a 60% reduction by 2030? And will you make it into law? I'll start with Tim. You're on mute.
Yes, we will. And indeed, we've advocated that same 60% in the last 2 elections. I think the challenge in making it into law is important. I also have to say that given the amount of time that's passed and the lack of action for 8 years of Stephen Harper and the very slow action since 2015 with the Liberal government, that we are going to probably need to crank up our ambitions beyond 60%. I say that as a practitioner, as someone who's involved with the issues, that I know the challenges are immense. Setting targets is one thing, putting into law is also a good thing, but beyond that, we probably need more ambitious plans because some are going to not achieve the targets that we want.
Thank you, Tim. Nicole?
Yes, New Democrats will set a target of reducing Canada's emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. And I personally will advocate for that number to increase to 60%. I will be a strong voice in Ottawa, fighting to protect our environment and our future. I will also support the creation of a climate accountability office to provide independent oversight of federal climate process.
Thank you. And Grisha?
Our target is ambitious, achievable, and fully costed. 3 key pillars: a price on pollution rising to $170 a ton by 2030, investing in the transition, $100 billion since 2015, $53 billion since last fall, and in our platform, a hard cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. That's going to get us to 40 to 45% reduction, which we can do.
Thank you to the 3 of you. Now, my next question, to which again I hope to get a yes or no and why answer, is will you push your party's leadership to end all government support for fossil fuel expansion, including subsidies and other types of support, such as those provided by Export Development Canada? Nicole?
Yes, absolutely, if need be. However, our party's leadership already supports that and doesn't need to be pushed. We're committed to ending government subsidies for fossil fuels, and will fulfill Canada's G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and redirect these funds into low carbon initiatives. And I will make sure that future governments can't reverse this by supporting legislation to ban any future oil, gas, and pipeline subsidies.
Thank you very much. Grisha?
Yes, our platform commits to a hard cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. That means they cannot go up, and to credible 5-year targets to bring those emissions down to net zero by 2050. And we are going to exceed our G20 commitment on removing fossil fuel subsidies. We're going to do that by 2023.
And Tim?
Well, it'll surprise no one that the Green Party has advocated for an end of fossil fuel subsidies for quite some time. And I'm glad the question included the Export Development Corporation, because the subsidies come through many channels, and provincial governments, including our province of Ontario, subsidize fossil fuels. I think what's really going to be needed, however, to make our climate action work is essentially to create an inner cabinet that represents all of the parties in Parliament and helps to bring policy coherence so that climate change is no longer a political football.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, on my 3rd yes or no question, and I know these are rapid, but it's for us to get a broad overview of where your mind is at and where your parties are at. Will you acknowledge and will your actions reflect the fact that credible, effective, emergency scale actions on climate requires any, oh, sorry about that. I already went on this one, I was thinking. Actually, this one is much longer. It has a lot of twists and turns. Will you advocate and will your actions represent the fact that developing a transparent and credible plan to halt and reverse nature loss, to protect, I don't know if someone's campaigning or door knocking at my door in University of Rosedale, it's not one of you. I'll do that again. Will you advocate for developing a transparent and credible plan to halt and revert nature loss, to protect biodiversity and species at risk, and to meet Canada's commitment to protect at least 30% of land, freshwater, and oceans by 2030, with measures to cut down rate of Canada's boreal, Carolinian, and other old growth forests, and to protect the green belts that are essential to the well-being of ecosystems and human settlements in most population regions of the country. For those following this, the question is also in the chat because that was very, very long. But Nicole, once you've heard that whole question, can we start with you?
Yes, absolutely. I grew up in a small fishing community in Nova Scotia, actually, in Petite Communauté Acadienne. And teenagers that were just a few years older than me while I was growing up had part-time jobs working in the fishing industry, gutting fish mostly. And by the time it was my turn to get a part-time job, that industry was totally decimated by overfishing. So I really have seen the impact of that on not only our environment, but also on the jobs as well. So I'm deeply committed to the environment and to protecting our land and resources.
Thank you. Tim.
Yes, not to be smug, but I think this question was lifted from our 2015, 2019, and 2021 platforms. Yeah, 30% has been the internationally recognized target for both marine ecosystems, land-based, I hate that expression, land-based systems, and aquatic ecosystems. And they remain as critical as they were. And in a climate emergency that we're now in, where we have forest fires raging, that challenge is even greater. But we also face land sprawl and other challenges that are reducing habitat. And certainly, wildlife corridors and so forth. So we've got a big challenge ahead of us.
Certainly, and Christia.
Yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely, yes. We are totally committed to protecting 25% of land and oceans by 2025, 30% by 2030. We're already making progress. When we formed government, only 1% of oceans were protected. Now we're up to 14%. And we have protected a landmass equal to 3.5 times the size of Nova Scotia. And I'm proud of what we're doing for cities. The $20 million Toronto Ravine Strategy is one example of how nature is for cities too, and for city kids.
Thank you very much. And the three of you actually brought up topics that will come up in my next question. So I appreciate that. That felt like a heartfelt yes. My last question of these yes or no questions is, will you acknowledge the fact that beyond ending the expansion of fossil fuels, emergency scale action actually demands winding down current production and embracing the full potential of energy efficiency and renewable energy? And Christia, I'd like to start with you.
Absolutely. So the answer is unequivocally yes. We are going to bring in a hard cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector and clear 5-year targets for the sector to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We're going to require oil and gas companies to reduce their methane emissions by 75% compared to their 2012 levels by 2030, and a lot of incentives for clean tech. This is the industry of the future. Something I'm excited about is a tax credit of up to 30% for clean technologies. Great jobs for young Canadians, young U of T students.
Thank you so much. Nicole.
Yes, absolutely. We won't be buying any pipelines, and we will ensure, again, that the climate crisis runs through everything that we do. It runs through our entire platform. We have a plan to create more than 1 million new jobs in all communities and rebuild local economies while helping to make the changes we need to succeed in a low carbon future. And this will include jobs building green infrastructure in communities across the country.
Thank you. And Tim.
Well, this is yes, of course. We, carbon emissions from the oil and gas sector have increased 86% in the last 10 years, and they're still increasing year by year in Canada. We're the only G7. So I do appreciate the good words that have already been spoken in answer to this question, but I have to remind viewers that we are the only party before you that isn't supporting a new pipeline, and we're the only party that's not supporting, that is in support of the state of Michigan, who wants to shut down Line 5, a 70-year-old pipeline under the Strait of Mackinac that's leaked 60 times in the last 10 years. So, I think it's really important for all the parties to acknowledge that on the one hand, they're calling for those other three parties an expansion of oil and gas, while they're also calling for a hard cap. It's going to be tough, I think, for their platforms to balance that.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to the three of you for answering my rapid questions. I hope you feel warmed up for the rest. I'm glad that you introduced us to a lot of topics that we are going to revisit. You've spoken about jobs, and we're going to get to that in a second. Now, as I alluded to in my introduction, we're not all equal in the face of the climate crisis and in facing the consequences of climate action as well. So let's dive into that maybe for a bit. I'm wondering, and we were wondering, will you commit to a green and just pandemic recovery, helping build a low carbon future that centers people's health and well-being and prioritizes a just transition for workers and communities? And I'm going to ask you how you plan on doing this, but I would like to add that we're specifically interested in hearing what are you going to do to make sure that this also addresses the inequities and economic drivers that contribute to current social injustices, human rights violations, environmental degradation, and that lead to marginalized communities to, again, be disproportionately affected by this. And again, to the public, the question is also in the chat. Nicole, I'm wondering if I can start with you.
Yes, absolutely. Environmental and economic justice must go hand in hand, and I'm committed to a pandemic recovery which prioritizes both. I do want to mention in relation to Tim's previous comment that I don't support pipelines, and there's no mention of pipelines as well in the NDP commitments for this election. In my humanitarian work, as I've mentioned before, I have seen the impact of a climate crisis and epidemics on people, and it doesn't matter what kind of crisis it is always those who are already vulnerable who are disproportionately impacted. And I've seen it overseas in many places, but also in Canada as well. I've seen it in Williams Lake in British Columbia, responding to fires there, working in a reception center, and really seeing those most marginalized were the only folks who were coming for assistance. And I do really believe that the NDP is really truly the only party who cares about people, who cares about you, and who cares about me, and who makes policies that take care of all of us. You know, and speaking about marginalized communities, I'm someone who identifies as queer and non-binary, and I have seen how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted my community, and especially those most marginalized in my community, such as trans women of color. So I'm deeply committed to supporting everyone in our society. And the NDP has a plan to provide dental care and provide pharma care and provide mental health support. Also, we know who's profited from this pandemic, and we want to make sure that those who have profited from the pandemic pay their fair share and support the rest of us.
Thank you, Nicole. Christia.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. Look, you started by asking about people and the pandemic and the recovery, and that is such an important question. And I have to say, for me personally, people and supporting Canadians has been at the heart of our fight against the pandemic. And I think Canadians and people in University of Rosedale know it. 1 in 4 people in Ontario has received the CERB. And I talked to people at the door who mentioned that to me. 2.1 million jobs in Ontario have been supported by the wage subsidy. These programs were expensive, they were historic, and they were so important in supporting Canadians. And they're working. 92% of jobs lost during COVID have been recovered in Canada, compared to just 75% in the United States. So that is putting people first. Now, you talked about how women, how vulnerable communities, how BIPOC people are particularly vulnerable. I agree. That's why our recovery plan very much focuses on women, with $30 billion for early learning and childcare. One of the things I am proudest of, $18 billion to support Indigenous people in Canada, and an unprecedented Black entrepreneurship fund to support Black entrepreneurs in Canada and to support that wealth generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christia. And Tim.
Thank you. Well, to add to Nicole and Christia's good points, I think the pandemic clearly has had an enormously negative impact on the most marginalized of Canadians, as Nicole and Christia both eloquently stated. and CERB and other federal programs have rescued millions, as Christian pointed out. What that says to us, and what Greens have advocated for some time now, is a guaranteed livable income. We think the stage is set, and it's more needed than it has ever been before. We had an Ontario pilot that lasted only a year with 4,000 individuals a few years ago that demonstrated that when people have a stable, reliable income, they can retrain, they can take new courses, they can go, and they've got the stability that they're going to need to get out of this pandemic.
Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to talk about justice and to center the fact that we all agree that justice is going to be core to this fight. I know it was very important in the community questions we had as well in preparing for this conversation. Now, of course, the climate crisis is a top of mind issue, but we also heard from community members about how much toxics and waste are also top of mind for this election and in general. And so I'd like to ask you all about these topics specifically. Now, again, give you a bit of a background before I go into this question. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, also called CEPA, is our overarching law to protect the health and environment for Canadians. And the act has actually not been significantly amended since 1999, which is the year I was born. That was a very long time ago. So it has not been amended since then, despite some major changes in how we understand the effects of toxic substances on our environment. There was actually a recent bill that introduced it in the last parliament, but it didn't make it past the first reading. And so answering with a yes/no question, and why, so it's gonna be a short question. Will you support getting this bill reintroduced, strengthened, and made a top priority in the next government? And Tim, I'll start with you.
Yes, Greens were in support of that bill that was introduced, but listen, all Canadians deserve a right to a healthy environment, and it needs to be in legislation. So we absolutely yes.
Thank you. Christian?
An unequivocal yes as well, Eleanor. And I had to smile when you said that 1999 was a long time ago. My eldest child was born in 2001. And when I looked at this question, I really thought about my own children. And I think a concern, obviously every single person has, but really every single mother has, is toxins in the environment, in the food your children eat, in the air they breathe, in the water they drink. And so an unequivocal yes.
You there because we're over time.
Okay, we introduced a bill, we support it. Yes.
Thank you. There you go. And Nicole.
Yes, as the other two candidates have said, New Democrats want to strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and we want to build and improve on the government's Bill C-28 to better protect Canadians from toxic substances in everyday products like cosmetics.
Thank you very much. Great, and a reminder that this is being recorded, so I'll be looking at which one of you gets elected and reminding you of that unequivocal yes from all of you. Now let's talk about waste, because Canadians actually generate the most waste per capita of all countries. And the plastic industry produces an ever increasing amount of plastics from virgin fossil fuels and other additives, many of which are toxic and in a wide range of format that are simply designed to be thrown away. So tell us, and you can take a minute or so here, how you will ensure that single-use plastic products are eliminated as much as possible, and that plastic manufacturers pay the cost of the pollution they create? And how will you encourage and support a true circular economy, focusing on the reuse much more than the ineffective and expensive recycling? And Tim, let's start with you.
Great. Well, I was going to tell you a little story. Maybe 60 seconds won't give me that time, but let me just say that yes, obviously, planned obsolescence has been the bane of waste of our efforts to reduce waste in Canada now for decades. And we need measures that are going to bring us towards that circular economy. Starting with plastics, we need to radically increase the number of single-use plastics that are banned beyond what has been proposed. We also have a global plastics trade that needs to be regulated, and we need Canada to participate in developing a global agreement amongst other countries. As you know, Canada was in the news from dumping plastics into third world countries, that some of whom, like the Philippines, sent them back to us. So clearly we have a crisis we need to address, and Canada has to work with the provinces to bring in measures that increase the length of I bought a refrigerator recently, and it was clear from talking to all the manufacturers, they last only 10 years. That's not good enough.
Thank you. Nicole.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Rwanda a few years ago in the context of my humanitarian work, and found out while I was there that they've banned plastic bags since 2008. So I don't know why we still have plastic bags in Canada and why that hasn't been done yet. But New Democrats will immediately ban single-use plastics, and while at the same time protecting workers who work in this sector and supporting the transition of these production facilities into new products. And an important part as well is really holding the companies accountable and making them responsible for the entire life cycle of their plastic products.
Thank you. And Christia?
Again, a very emphatic yes. Our government is already banning the use of single-use plastics, and it's great to have such clear agreement that that's the right thing for Canada to do. We have a commitment to eliminate plastic waste by 2030 and create a circular economy. We're now going to ensure in our platform that by 2030, all plastic packaging needs to be at least 50% recycled. We're going to use the power of federal government procurement to push more reusable and recyclable products to drive that circular economy. And finally, this is a transition, a shift that costs money. And so our government will invest $100 million to scale up and commercialize reusable and recyclable materials.
Thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time to answer this question. And some of these topics, if we have time at the end, we have a little more questions from the communities that we might use to revisit this. I'll go again to one of the big themes that emerged when we were thinking about these issues, and that is environmental rights and how they intersect with Indigenous rights. So Indigenous folks were more impacted by COVID. They are going to be more impacted by the climate crisis, and they are still impacted by the ongoing effects of colonization. We also know that they are going to play a crucial role in environmental solutions. So the first question I have for you here is, will you, if elected, implement the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so UNDRIP? And would you implement the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Christia, let's start with you.
Yeah, so yes, I fully support UNDRIP and its implementation, as does our government. And we are committed to an approach to UNDRIP and reconciliation, which is a whole of government approach. You know, as you suggested in your question, Eleanor, this is a challenge for our whole society, our whole country. And so it needs to be a challenge for everyone working in a government. I would say everyone working in parliament. We are going to include implementation of UNDRIP in all ministers' letters if we do form government. And again, in the budget we tabled in April, there was $18 billion to support Indigenous people in Canada and reconciliation.
Okay, thank you. Nicole.
Yes, absolutely. I'm fully committed to the implementation of the UN Declaration, as well as all of the calls to the commission. New Democrats recognize that really this is the bare minimum and just the beginning of what needs to be done. We're committed to making reconciliation central to our plan to address the environmental crisis and ensuring that Indigenous peoples are full and equal partners.
Thank you. And Tim?
Well, to add to the good points that Nicole and Christia would say, I would just point out a couple of things. One, that I think the words reconciliation, First Nations, and Indigenous are the most commonly found words in our platform, because in implementing the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are itemized, are found sprinkled throughout our platform. But I think we also need something much bigger if we're really going to reconcile the troubled history that we've had as a settler country with Indigenous peoples. And we've proposed a Council of Canadian Governments, which is a four-part body. In other words, not just the federal government talking to the provinces, but also putting cities and First Nations at the table in an ongoing conversation, because they deserve to be at the table in order to have the perspectives of cities, currently seen as creatures of the province, and First Nations.
I'm going to have to stop you here, Tim. Thank you very much. Thank you to the three of you for answering this. And actually, I have a follow-up question here about including Indigenous peoples in our environmental action. Will you, if elected, transparently and adequately invest in Indigenous-led land use planning and establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas? And Tim, let's hear from you.
Sure, we do, absolutely, yes. But we also think it's important that those processes be led by Indigenous communities. That's really critical. In addition, so that's my quick answer.
Thank you. You caught me off guard here, Nicole.
He was making up for going over the last time. Yes, I mean, absolutely. Indigenous peoples are best suited to protect cultural and ecological diversity through the control of their territory. And I support upholding Indigenous rights to protect lands, waterways, and biodiversity through working with Indigenous governments. And this means that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people should be full and equal partners, as Tim mentioned, in our efforts to create a low carbon future.
Thank you, Christia.
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. So yes, and I already mentioned the $18 billion in the spring budget to support Indigenous people in Canada and reconciliation. Let me break that down a little bit. That was money to support Indigenous healthcare services, Indigenous early learning and childcare, Indigenous infrastructure, Indigenous entrepreneurship, and it very much includes respecting Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous-led conservation. We have 27 Indigenous protected and conserved areas already, and we're absolutely committed to building more.
Thank you to the three of you for those answers. And before I go into the next questions, I'm just going to invite the audience here. If you're thinking this is a very interesting debate, we actually are also live on YouTube. And so if you want to send this to your neighbors, to your family, friends, we still have a lot of questions to go. And I think it'd be great to have more folks join us and inform us, but many of you are here. So I'd like to get also a better sense of your willingness to collaborate with other elected officials, because we know that this is going to be a group effort and a whole of country effort. So to make sure that environmental and climate concerns are best addressed, will you join the All-Party Climate Caucus to work collaboratively with MPs from across the aisle on policy solutions? And Christia, let's start with you.
So yes, absolutely. I am a big believer that when it comes to facing big national challenges, the way that Canada succeeds is when we can adopt a Team Canada approach. And that was my experience during the NAFTA trade negotiations. That was my experience during the fight against COVID. And I think as a country, we need to get there when it comes to climate action. And, you know, I will say, since I'm looking at Tim right now on the screen, Elizabeth May is someone who I've sat next to in Parliament. And, you know, we are email and text buddies. And the same is true of many colleagues from the NDP. I think progressives in particular, but let's hope we can expand the tent to include all Canadians. And all Canadian parties need to work together on this existential challenge.
Thank you. Tim, what about yourself?
Well, I mentioned earlier that we've pitched now in a couple of elections that there needs to be essentially an inner climate cabinet. And the reason for doing that, I'll just add to the points that Christia made, because indeed there was great collaboration in the early days of COVID amongst all the parties, and good on the Liberals to make that happen. But I think if you have an inner cabinet and you invite all the parties that are in Parliament to participate, that puts them into the team that is making the decisions around climate, and they can't, so they have to be on the same page. And that takes us a lot further than simply having an all-party caucus or climate team that still allows the parties to vigorously debate and deny where they want to.
Okay, I'm hearing a call here for even more inclusion. And Nicole, what about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that, you know, this is a crisis and all parties should be working together to, to fix it and to make sure that you know, our children all have a future. In humanitarian work, when I'm responding to disasters or crises, everyone works together. So it doesn't matter, you know, if you're a community organization or the government or aid organizations, everyone works together because we recognize that it's a big disaster and everyone, it's all hands on deck. And so I think it needs to be the same here.
Well, thank you to the three of you. And now that you've all you know, agreed on how important collaboration is, I'll have a question on that. Is we're wondering, will you endorse the request from the City of Toronto that the Prime Minister of Canada directs government officials to negotiate a global treaty for the non-proliferation of fossil fuels at COP26 in order to build international cooperation and international momentum in the necessary phase out of fossil fuel? So, Tim, let's start with you.
Sorry, I just muted myself. There's lots of people who like to see me muted, so that's a bad thing for me to be doing it to myself. Absolutely, yes. The city has taken the lead as cities around the world, many of whom have done in the absence of their own national government's leadership. And I applaud the City of Toronto, and we absolutely endorse this resolution being taken by the Government of Canada to COP26.
Thank you. Okay, Christian.
So I really love working with cities across the country, and I love working with our own City of Toronto. And I very much agree we need international cooperation on this issue. I want to say, because I think this will be interesting for people, that Canada is really recognized around the world for the price we have on pollution. I was in June at the G7 finance ministers meeting, in July at the G20 meeting. People really see this as the key to driving climate efforts. And so we should be proud of that, and we should use that to help the rest of the world get to where it needs to be. And I totally agree. Okay, but I agree on COP26, and I could say more, but my time is done. Thanks and sorry.
It's hard to keep us on track otherwise, but Nicole, what about yourself in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Yeah, I will keep it short and say that, yes, absolutely. We agree with that. We should be doing everything that we can to get off fossil fuels. So New Democrats support this.
Thank you very much. And again, if folks watching us want to learn more, the City of Toronto has ratified this treaty, non-proliferation treaty for fossil fuels, and I really encourage you all to look into it after this debate, of course. Please don't leave us now. Now we have a little more time for this question, so you can breathe. Will you commit to informing the public about the climate crisis and engaging them on climate action as required by Article 12 of the Paris Agreement? And could you please tell us more about how you propose to engage the public here? Christian, let's start with you.
So I would absolutely say yes. And I think the questions tonight have been really excellent. But if I were still an editor, I would quibble with the informing the public part, because in my conversations with Canadians, I find I learn as much from what I hear as from what I say. Actually, I learn more from what people have to say to me than from what I have to tell them. So from my perspective, what we really need to do is have a national conversation and a national effort that all Canadians can be a part of. And I would say, especially young people. I find starting in my own house, young Canadians are really ahead of the curve on climate. We've committed more than $200 million to a climate action and awareness fund to help that action and that community activity happen. I think it is so important, and I really believe it can inform and drive government action.
Thank you. Tim.
Yes, education is a two-way street. Thanks, Christian. You're absolutely right. And it is one of the challenges, of course, of meeting our climate objectives is it's not just regulation. It's certainly not lifestyle changes, although that's a part. We need government leadership. It needs to be across all sectors. But we also need education first and foremost. And we see this even in a local project that I'm involved with. 50% of our efforts in the Harvard Village and across the 26 communities we're working with is education, because people have to understand the urgency of why it's important to switch to electric bikes and electric vehicles if they're going to have a personal vehicle, and why it's so urgent to get off gas for cooking and heating in our homes and apartments. And so our whole project is about facilitating as cheap as possible, a transition, but education is a critical component without which Canada or local communities will succeed.
Thank you. And Nicole.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. In the context of my humanitarian work, it's actually something that I've been doing for many, many years. And I think it's important to be able to actually speak firsthand to the impacts of the climate crisis. And then it becomes more tangible for people to actually see the impacts. So that's something that I've actually also been doing here as a candidate. Every door that I knock on is an opportunity to talk about that.
Thank you very much. The work starts before it really has a chance to start. Thank you to the three of you for talking about the important role of education on the climate crisis. Now, as you all pointed out, the public is already aware, and we had a lot of community questions come in. And so we're actually going to dive a little bit more into those. I encourage you all to just take a moment, breathe and stretch. We kind of went over our big core questions here that were posed by the partners. And we're now going to get ready to really focus on the ones that people submitted as they were registering for this event. But before that, our partners, the UTSU, have a question for you. And so I'll let Catherine, my co-host, get us started there.
Eleanor. My first question concerns the affordability of education in Canada. Although the government has offered financial supports for students and young adults throughout the pandemic, such as the CESB and the CURB, these programs have now closed. In view of the impacts of the COVID-19 economy and the impacts that it is posing on students and their current financial stability, which often relies on employment and post-secondary financial aid, in what ways do you propose to address this need? And I'll invite Christia to start us off.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the question, Catherine. And it's a question that I love because one of my strong convictions in the recovery from the COVID recession is that we need to recognize that young people have borne a disproportionate burden. You all made such a big sacrifice to protect your parents and grandparents. I am very grateful. And it's also the case that graduating into a recession can leave lifelong scars if there is not a real effort by governments to support you. So we're not going to let you be a lost generation. And there is a lot of support both in our budget and in our platform for young Canadians. $5.6 billion of support in the budget. That includes, when you add the platform, permanently eliminating federal interest on student loans and doubling the Canada Student Grant, saying that you don't have to start paying back your student loan until you are making at least $50,000. My time is running out, but I also want to say a big jobs effort, including Canada Summer Job Program here in University Rosedale. Early learning and childcare is going to help your generation, young Canadians, and our affordable housing effort will help you as well. And I just want to thank you guys for everything you've done in COVID.
Thank you so much, Christia. And now I'll pass it over to Tim.
Thank you very much. In the last election, we went big. We decided to, and we showed how we would cost a $10 billion program that would provide free tuition for post-secondary students. And the reason it's only $10 billion is that part of the funding to provide free tuition would come from 4 different sources of the federal government's current spending on student defaulted loans, the amount of money that at the other end that universities are spending to collect tuition, and so on. I could go on that. So we think that's absolutely critical given the hardships that students are facing, which Christia eloquently mentioned, Nicole will too. I've already mentioned guaranteed livable income, a monthly check for everyone over 18 that's going to give people the financial foundation. So no tuition. We think that's a fair and just solution to the crisis in post-secondary education that ensures that the lowest income people will participate. The other thing, final thing we would do is remove the 2% cap that limits the increases in funding for Indigenous students, Indigenous education rather.
Thank you, Tim. And over to you, Nicole, on financial assistance.
Yes, so I'll start off by saying that New Democrats fought to have CERB doubled, as well as the wage subsidy, and we asked for these supports to be continued because we know that the pandemic isn't over yet. Our vision in terms of post-secondary education is that everyone should have access to quality post-secondary education, regardless of their income. And so we want to work with provinces to reduce and cap tuition fees and really build a system, build towards making post-secondary education part of our public education system, so kids can go from kindergarten to a career without the barrier of cost. We want to introduce a targeted debt forgiveness program as well, to forgive up to $20,000 in student debt. And we also want to move away from loans as well and double non-repayable Canada student grants.
Well, thank you to the 3 of you for answering it. And Catherine, thank you to you and the UTSU for the work you do in representing student voices here. I think it's certainly important to remember that we need our students to be supported if they are to also deal with the climate crisis at hand. And so these issues are very much interlinked. Now let's return to the topic of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, because it is not an easy topic. And many community members were actually interested in hearing how you could help the cities tackle their emissions, even though you'd be working at the federal level. So across Canada, it is estimated that there are more than 10 million existing dwellings that need to be insulated, that need to have heat pumps installed or switch to electricity to reach our emissions reductions targets. A program that was to retrofit 60% of these over a decade at even something like $40,000 per dwelling would require $36 billion per year of investment. So clearly this is a big challenge, and I'd like to hear, how do you propose to organize the enormous retrofit undertaking to ensure that it gets done and to ensure that work continues, even if there's a change of government? Tim, I'd like to hear from you on this.
Oh boy, well, we proposed exactly this in 2019 and of course again in 2021, because it's a critical piece of solving the climate crisis. It's incredibly ambitious. The Canadian Labour Congress indicated it would create, if the government adopted this, would create 4 million jobs. Not this year, it's going to be something that needs to ramp up. But housing and climate authorities have told us it needs to be scaled. It can't be a bunch of $5,000 grants for a limited number of homeowners or electric vehicle rebates. We need a mobilization that is of an entirely different scale. And we've seen that in our local community efforts, that it's not a question of getting some good contractors here or there. We need a larger mobilization. People can literally move out of their houses for 2 days, is what the experts are saying, and come back into a retrofitted house 2 days later. That's the kind of scale that we need. And we don't see much of that ambition on the horizon at this moment.
Thank you, Tim. Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tim. I think it's a massive undertaking, and I think it really does need to start from the top, and it needs to start with a strong government that wants to do it. That's the first step, and then also just really, I mean, showing people that making these changes actually in the long run will save them money. So ensuring that we give people supports throughout this process, and also ensuring that jobs are created in this process as well. And that, yeah, I mean, I think that we just, in our plan, we have 500,000 units of affordable housing to go on top of that as well, which will all be made considering the climate.
Thank you very much. And Kristia.
Yeah, this is a really important question, and you framed it, Eleanor, as something really expensive, which you're right about. But I would just like to support where Tim started, which is we also need to see the retrofitting of Canadian buildings. And we're going to have to retrofit every building that exists today and be sure the new ones we build are totally green. That is also a tremendous job opportunity. So I really want us also to focus on the opportunities of climate action. This is not just a hair shirt. This is about shifting our economy, and there are going to be lots of opportunities and lots of jobs for young Canadians. A few very quick specifics. Look, the price on pollution of $170 a ton by 2030 is going to be a big driver of these changes throughout the economy. $250 million that we're going to invest to help low-income Canadians move from fossil fuel heating to energy efficient heating. We have to be sure we don't leave anyone behind. And I do think it's important to help people do the right thing with the $5,000 grants and the $40,000 loans we're providing to Canadians now, which you can take advantage of. If you're listening to this and you want to save money and save the planet, this is a great way to do it.
Thank you for these answers. And you've mentioned housing, you've mentioned youth, all of you. So I'll send it back to Catherine, who has another question from the Students' Union.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you three for your very insightful responses. I will now proceed with an issue on the minds of many students. There's no question that University of Rosedale, among many other ridings across Canada, is facing a housing crisis. From unhoused individuals living in park encampments to students who stretch their paychecks to make rent and tuition, the issue of affordable housing has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. How do you intend on advocating for safer, cheaper, and more affordable housing for students among other riding constituents? And I'll begin with Tim.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting. I've been a provincial candidate 3 times and a federal candidate twice. And from the get-go, one of our commitments is that no province should give to cities, and I would extend that to no federal government should give money for affordable housing to cities that don't already have an inclusionary zoning policy that says 30% of the units in every new condo building have to be affordable and or available for people with special needs. That means rich and poor on the same elevator, but it also means in Toronto, 30,000 units of affordable housing by right. In addition, the Green Party pledges that 1 point of the GST be dedicated permanently for housing and urban infrastructure.
Thank you, Tim. And now over to Kristia.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for raising this absolutely essential issue. I'll say a few things. One aspect that you raised is people experiencing homelessness. And I think the COVID pandemic has made us all even more aware of how unacceptable it is for people to be experiencing homelessness in a country like Canada. And that's why one of the things that I'm the most proud of is the Rapid Housing Initiative, which started during COVID and which we are doubling down on in our platform. This has delivered $300 million to the City of Toronto. And I want to give you one concrete example. UHN, University Hospital Network, is using some money from the Rapid Housing Initiative to build deeply, deeply affordable housing. And once it's done, $14 million for 51 units, doctors there in the emergency room are going to be able to say, when they have someone who comes in who is experiencing many different health challenges, they're going to be able to say, I prescribe for you a place to live. I think that's remarkable. And it's that kind of stuff that we need to be doing.
I have to stop you there. Catherine, I really appreciate you bringing up this important topic. And again, I appreciate the fact that the student union represents so well the students and their interests here. I now have a question that really matters greatly to me personally, because I'd like to talk about the youth and your youngest constituents. So young constituents, apologies, Nicole, please go ahead.
I'll just have to cut in. Nicole, on the topic of accessible and affordable housing. My apologies once again.
Oh, no worries. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I want to first start off talking about people experiencing homelessness as well, which Christia brought up. I really do feel very strongly about the kind of violence really that folks experiencing homelessness in encampments have been met with in this city. And so I just wanted to say that, again, New Democrats are a party that cares about people and cares about making situations safer for people. And so I would say that we have the only housing platform that's comprehensive and that looks at affordability and availability, and that we advocate for market wage houses. We are going to build 500,000 units of affordable housing. We're going to offer rental supports as well. And that, of course, will help out students as well.
Thank you. And Nicole, apologies again for cutting you off there, especially to deliver us such an important answer. I was very eager to ask the next question, and I still am. I want to talk about the youth and the youngest constituents in University Rosedale. Young people, young Canadians are facing a very daunting future, and I see it every day in the folks that I work with. As we see nations around the world continue to fail implementing climate action that science tells us is essential, we are getting more and more close to a future in which we're going to have to face 2.5, 3, 4 degrees of warming. And at the same time, we're often treated as junior partners in this conversation, and we're only invited to the conversation late or in a symbolic manner. So I want to ask you, how do you plan on giving your young constituents a real voice in what disproportionately affects them? And specifically, or additionally, I guess, there's been talks about funding for industry to step up and address the climate crisis. But are we going to have programs to enable young people to engage directly in practically addressing the climate crisis? What are you prepared to advocate for here? And Nicole, I'll start with you.
Thank you for not forgetting me. Yes, I mean, definitely young people are the ones who have to live with this. They should have a say. They're key stakeholders. You're all key stakeholders. I was at the climate rally in Queen's Park today, and it was really great to see so many young folks there. There were some young teenagers who aren't old enough to vote, who made a play, and at the end they talked about how they couldn't even vote. And so one thing New Democrats want to do is lower the voting age to 16 to give even younger people a voice. I would also like to see federal funds put into programs to support youth to engage directly in the climate crisis. And New Democrats as well have a plan to create a new civilian climate corps, which would mobilize young people and create jobs supporting conservation efforts across the country.
Thank you, Nicole. Tim.
Yes, we've been advocating for 3 elections now, a youth climate corps, not only but especially to deal with restoring ecosystems and to help us achieve the the 30% climate target that we talked about earlier. But clearly, if we're able to address the urgency of the 60, the retrofit of 10 million buildings over the next 10 years, and that's going to literally bring in hundreds of thousands of jobs, and those are primarily going to youth. So the bigger challenge is to help their institutions, particularly community colleges, ramp up programs to draw them in and provide this up. Well, we're proposing free tuition, but assuming not that those we aren't in power, that the government in power does provide supports for people to take up those programs that help Canada meet our climate targets.
Thank you, Tim, for that answer. And Christia.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eleanor. Look, part of the reason that I talked about how I don't see myself as informing people as much as learning from people is I really feel that I learned from people living in University Rosedale, especially young people. And both when we were doing the pre-budget consultations and after the budget was tabled, I had a lot of meetings with young Canadians across the country, and those definitely informed concrete measures in the budget. So that's really important to do. I also want to say, I really believe young people are going to provide and are already providing really important intellectual leadership in the green economy that is going to move us off the fossil fuel economy we have now. But then finally, you talked about our youngest constituents. Our very youngest constituents are children. And one thing this election is going to determine is whether we get a universal early learning and childcare system across Canada. I believe in it passionately. And look, if toddlers could vote, we would have it already. It is something they need. It is something that will give the youngest Canadians the best possible start in life. And it's something I am personally absolutely committed to building. And it will help slightly older, but still young Canadians as you start your family. Childcare in Toronto has been described to me as like a second mortgage. I want it to cost you just $10 a day.
Thank you. I think if toddlers could vote, we would have a lot of other things, but I take your point. Well, we are getting to the end of our conversation here, but I do have two last questions that came from the community, again, people that are attending this right now. The first one is that on June 2nd, Canada's Parliament voted unanimously upon a second reading in favor of Bill C-272. So for those of you that don't know, it was about the right to repair. The private members' bill targets technological protection measures under Canada's Copyright Act. What regulations and support will you introduce to ensure that this important measure around electronics longevity is implemented effectively? Tim, let's start with you.
The story I was going to tell you earlier was trying to take apart our 20-year-old front-loading washing machine and see if it was possible to order the part that was broken. And in the end, we had to conclude not. So it was a painful, quite physically exhausting effort that made the point to us clearly that we have to have regulations. We have to have that limit planned obsolescence, that insist that appliances are going to last, minimum periods of time. But on electronics, what's needed at the moment, of course, it's only manufacturers that can repair their appliances. And we need a right to repair requires manufacturers to make available not only the software, the repair manuals, but also the repair parts at reasonable costs to independent retailers that can do that kind of repair if the owner of those electronic devices cannot themselves repair it. But those are the steps that are required to get us where we need to go.
Right, thank you. And Christia, on the right to repair.
Okay, I love this question because I feel very, very strongly about it. I was with Brian May, whose private members bill this is, just 10 days ago in Cambridge, Ontario. And I just want to say, hi, Brian, if you ever watch this video, and thank you so much for your hard work on this essential issue. Really, really important. I voted for the bill, and I am personally, and our whole party is really committed to it. We also would introduce a new 15% tax credit of up to $500 to cover the cost of repairs. And we would amend the Copyright Act to ensure that it cannot prevent the repair of digital devices and systems.
Thank you. And Nicole.
Yes, we absolutely want to remove the unnecessary restrictions preventing people from repairing their devices, and also making companies responsible for e-waste related to their products. I'm also concerned not just about the products ending up in the landfills, but also the workers in the mines that mine some of the materials that are made that electronic equipment is made from. So I'm also concerned not only about the impact on the environment, but also with the workers as well.
Thank you. And Tim gives you a thumbs up. Well, thank you very much. Now I have a final question, and the final question is actually about the emissions coming from our military. Those of you watching might be thinking, what does that have to do with climate or the environment? But the Department of Defense is actually the largest institutional emitter by far in Canada. So what I'd like to hear from you is, how do you propose to address the enormous carbon budget of the military and the continued investment in weaponry that locks us into decades of continued emissions? And what is your position on including military carbon emissions in greenhouse gas reductions targets? Nicole, let's start with you.
Yes, the New Democrats believe that we should absolutely include the military in this. We also don't want our military engaged in unnecessary combat as well. And we're not going to be producing and selling military equipment, and really only want to be engaged in an active mission if there's a real strict humanitarian imperative.
Thank you very much. Kristia, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I absolutely believe that government spending and government procurement, including for the military, can and really must drive the green transition. And I'll give you a few examples of things that we think need to happen with the military. We're committing to DND reducing its GHG emissions from infrastructure and commercial light vehicle fleets by 40% below 2005 levels by 2025. That's 5 years ahead of the initial target. And as of 2019-2020, DND Defense had reduced emissions by 31%. We're investing $165 million in green infrastructure and clean technology, and we're investing in clean, green aerospace, which is a really big technical challenge for the whole economy and an area where Canada's defense investments can really lead the way.
Thank you. And Tim, I'll go to you.
Yes, the military's portion of their carbon emissions must be included in Canada's budget, but we're not going to get very far if that's all we do. We really need to reorient the military in a couple of fundamental ways. I'll start with canceling the purchase of 88 fighter jets that's on the horizon at an initial purchase of $19 billion, but a lifetime cost of, people that say close over 70 billion, and redeploying. We need that money for the green transition, for affordable housing and other things. We also think really the heat waves and the wildfires of the last summer, this past summer, and around the world have also reminded us that the Army really needs a new, that's the mission for the Canadian military, is to redeployment to deal with natural disasters. That's the training they need in addition to combat readiness if and when needed. As the Canadian military the last 20 years have rarely been involved. And finally, we need to support military industries to transition to civilian uses. None of us were very proud to see Canadian-made military tanks going to Saudi Arabia for use in the Yemen civil war. None of us were proud of that. It's time to change.
Well, thank you all for these important answers. I certainly learned a lot because this is a question that comes less often when we talk about climate and the environment, and those were very important answers here. Now, I want to sincerely say merci, thank you again, I've said it many times today, for being willing to answer my many questions and for covering such a wide range of topics all at once. Now, before we leave you to your respective campaigns, which we hope will be safe and successful, well, let's hear from each of you one last time. I'll give you a minute to give us a short closing statement. And Tim, whenever you're ready, let's start with you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. Again, to the organizers, to Christian, Nicole, et cetera, and to all of you who've tuned in. We've talked a lot about climate and what Greens would bring to the table. We've talked about a guaranteed livable income and why that's needed more than ever to replace the income supports that always leave people behind, some people behind. We haven't talked about cities that are crucial to climate and to the environmental issue, but who only get 10 cents on the tax dollar and have any decision they make can be overturned by provincial governments. We are strongly in support of city charters. And I'm sorry, Nicole, to pick on you about the Coastal GasLink pipeline, but anyone has to just put Jagmeet Singh LNG into a browser and they'll see an interview with your leader asked 3 times, do you support the Coastal GasLink? And he refused to answer. It's because the BC NDP do it. Folks, if you liked any of these answers, you want to get involved in our campaign, go to votetimgrant.ca. We'd welcome your help. Thanks for listening in any case.
Thank you. Kristia, let's hear from you whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I am just going to speak very candidly and from the heart, based on the conversation we've just had. So in the course of this campaign, I have been part of some really ugly scenes where there has been the kind of behavior I never thought I would see in Canada. The kinds of words used, including racial epithets directed towards, say, people just doing their job in the RCMP, and just horrible, hateful language and behavior. And I knew in my heart that this was, yes, a very loud group, yes, a bullying group, but a minority, that this was not Canada. And this conversation, albeit virtual, with young people working hard to facilitate an intelligent and important and substantive conversation with a really collegial atmosphere between 3 candidates who each one of us wants you to vote for us at the end of the day, but we've managed to smile at each other and speak in a respectful way. I almost feel like crying. I feel like this really is Canada and how Canada works. And so I just want to thank everyone very, very much. And I just want to say collectively, let's maintain this spirit. And this is Canada. This is how we need to be.
Well, I'll have to stop you here. We've gone a tiny bit over time. Nicole, again, whenever you're ready, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes. Thank you again to the organizers. Thank you to Tim. Thank you to Kristia. Thank you to those of you joining us, and especially the students. I want to reiterate again that I have been on the front lines of climate change, and I have seen firsthand the impacts on people, and I'm deeply committed to tackling this. I think we need big and bold changes, and those aren't being taken right now. We really need to stand up to the oil and gas lobby and transition out of fossil fuels. New Democrats are the only party that really, as I mentioned earlier, weaves climate throughout our entire platform, because we recognize how important it is to tackle this issue. And we, New Democrats, will continue to put people at the center of our climate policy by prioritizing the needs of workers, addressing inequities, upholding Indigenous rights. We are the party that cares about people, and I hope you'll consider this when you vote. Thank you.
And a very large thank you to Tim, Kristia, and Nicole for joining us this evening and for your continued dedication to the University Rosedale riding. The University of Toronto Student Union greatly values the fruitful and open discussions that you have all contributed here tonight. And in engaging with our community to addressing important matters concerning the global climate crisis, student affairs, racial injustice, and the COVID-19 recovery, and recognizing that these issues are all very interconnected, we hope that our viewers, the students, and the residents of University Rosedale are able to make an educated and informed decision by September 20th, Election Day, that will propel Canada into an accessible, affordable, and sustainable future for our country.
That concluded very well this University Rosedale Green Pact Debate 2021. Merci à tous. Thank you all for participating. To those who tuned in, I hope this debate was informative and that now you have a little more clarity. There will be a recording available to you if you want to watch it again. I also encourage you to look through the platforms, look up our candidates, and perhaps you'll also meet them in our neighborhoods. I really want to say a thank you and a congrats to the many people you don't see behind the scenes who have done everything from writing those questions, thinking about logistics for a panel online. And this is really the first elections they've had to do that. So thank you to them. Thank you to the outreach team. A lot of work has gone behind the scenes and that work is seen. Now remember, please vote on September 20th or before. Elections Canada has all the information you need. It's a few clicks away. It is your right. So I'm really asking you, please vote on September 20th and bring your friends and family to vote with you. Merci à tous. Je vous souhaite une très bonne soirée. Thank you all. It was a pleasure to host tonight and take care. I hope you all have a safe campaign. Au revoir.